Hello, students. I hope all of you are doing well and having a nice Veterans Day. I think it's actually kind of appropriate that we're doing this on Veterans Day today because this is actually quite relevant to the question of modern war and these ideas of how war is really going to change a lot in the 1900s. And we're going to see that today. So, thank you guys for checking out this online lecture. I usually do these when, for whatever reason, I can't make it to class. Today, I'm still contagious from a illness that I've been fighting off this weekend, so bear in mind, bear with me if something I say doesn't make sense. So if you've got questions about this, just ask me later. Just remember though that we will have a short quiz at the beginning of class on Thursday about what we're going to cover today. So it's going to be very straightforward, big main questions, just to make sure that you watched the video. So let's jump right through it. So these are the two main questions for today. So basically it's pretty straightforward, both of them. What starts World War One? That's the big question. What does it start? How does it start? And I'm looking here not for just short-term reasons, but also long-term. What are the long-term things that lead to World War One? What are the patterns that emerge, and why do they emerge? So for specific examples, good to go there. So the second question, how is World War One different from other wars? It'll be pretty apparent when we get going. And so sort of look for how it's different and then look at the human cost and then the greater impacts that this is going to have on the world as a whole. So keep those in mind as we're going forward. So one of the big things that's going to lead into the growth of World War One is this idea about nationalism. And we talked about nationalism a little bit last time as sort of being born from these new ideas of states and liberty and these ideas of one country being better than another. And this is going to come into full force by the 1800s and certainly by the 1900s. And we're going to see that specifically in a minute here. So, what is nationalism? Nationalism is simply the belief that one's country is worthy of praise. And at its core, that doesn't necessarily sound like a bad or a dangerous thing. But one of the problems with this is that implicit in that idea, so sort of based in this idea that my country is great, is the implicit understanding that other countries are inferior. Because in order for my country to be the best, that means that somebody has to be the worst. And one of the things that happened is this nationalist idea sort of builds out of Enlightenment principles, these ideas of state building and sort of self-determination. And after these many states have entered the modern world, so you can kind of think of like the French Revolution or the American Revolution or the Russian Revolution, which we're going to talk about next time, we can look at these things and say, well, people start to develop a fondness for their country. It used to be that it took a lot to motivate people to do something. It usually had to be you had to motivate people to do things on religious reasons, or you had to motivate people on ethnic reasons to do something, particularly when we're talking about war. It usually took a lot to motivate someone to pick up a gun or pick up a spear to kill somebody. Oftentimes that's money. But in the 1800s and 1900s, nationalism, and to a lesser extent this idea of patriotism, start to become part of the reason that people will engage in warfare. This idea that my country's great and you guys, you other people, have been keeping us down for centuries, and that you might have our respective lands. But the key here is that nationalism creates this idea within people's minds that part of the reason that we can go to war as people and part of the reason that we can get into conflicts is because some countries should deserve more than other countries, based basically on where you are and what you're from. Now, again, I'm not trying to, and I do have to preface this, I'm not trying to say that if you're patriotic, that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying that this is one of the things that people often use to justify warfare. And we're going to see that big time today in World War One. So, alongside nationalism comes this third point that's really important here, and this is the growth of propaganda. We saw a little bit of propaganda when we talked about American imperialism. If you remember, we talked about these ideas of yellow journalism and sort of creating this idea that the the enemy is doing these terrible things and we need to stop, and they're doing these awful atrocities. Well, one of the things that's interesting is in the 1900s we actually see the growth of state-sponsored propaganda. So here's an example of sort of Russian nationalist propaganda. You can see the symbol of Russia. You can see them holding the crown and the scepter, and they've got the symbols of their industrial military might. And propaganda is going to be really important to our story. Propaganda and this idea of nationalism go hand in hand, because one of the ways you build nationalism is you build nationalism through propaganda. You have to convince people that they're part of your ethnic homeland, their traditional country. And that's one of the ways that propaganda is so powerful. And we'll see that through the rest of this course. Propaganda becomes hugely important after the late 1800s. And also implicit in these ideas is the ideas of national or ethnic homelands. And this is actually going to be really important even for today. Because the idea is that, well, if I'm proud to be a member of my country, well, that's well and good if, for example, I'm in a country that's already independent. So I can be a proud American and say that's really great because our country's already independent. Well, what if you say, for example, as many people did in the 1800s and 1900s, say, well, I'm a proud Armenian, for example. We'll talk about Armenia later on in this lecture. Say, well, I'm a proud Armenian. Well, the Armenians were part of the Ottoman Empire. They wanted to have their own self-rule, they wanted to self-govern, and they end up getting massacred for it. Because the idea was that no, these are these are supposed to be our national ethnic homelands. This is where our people have always lived for thousands of years. That's what they told the Ottomans. The Ottomans don't take it quite that way. So just keep in mind that this nationalistic idea doesn't just apply to big empires and states. It can apply to smaller groups of people who are kept down as well. So that's certainly one of the ways that the world is setting itself for the First World War. And perhaps one of the bigger reasons is this, and it's called the alliance system. And this is something that we've all talked about in our high school history courses, but it bears repeating here. So what happens is in the 1900s, in the late 1880s, 1890s, Europe starts to create these very sound and very cemented alliances. But I really want to reemphasize this first point. Alliances have always existed in Europe. And think about it like this, right? Great Britain has always disliked France, and they've always disliked France, and so they'd work with the enemies of France. They'd work with the people who live in modern day Germany. They might work with the Spaniards sometimes. They might work with the Italians sometimes to get against France. They've always had alliances like that. Well, the Danes might not like the people in Germany, so they might work with the people in the Dutch Netherlands over here. They might work with the Russians to go against these people over here. And that's true for every state in Europe. There's always been alliances that had existed in Europe. But what happens is in the late 1800s and early 1900s, these alliances become solidified. And there's two main reasons for this. And they're basically what you see here: nationalism and paranoia. And nationalism is the first main reason, perhaps the biggest reason. And it's this idea that, well, our countries are really, really great, and we need to maintain this level of power. Because it used to be that alliances in the past were sort of based on royal ties. So like, oh, my king is married to your king's stepdaughter, and so therefore we're going to be allies now. Or our king has access to these economic lands in your territory, so we're going to be allies now. Well, the problem with that is once a king dies, that alliance falls apart, and then it dissolves it. So those alliances don't stick very strongly. But what happens when you create an alliance based on nationalism? That's something totally different, and that's what ends up happening. The idea is that Europeans start to now have this idea of what it means to be a French nationalist, what it means to be a Russian patriot, or what it means to be a German patriot or a British patriot. And then when you create alliances based on these ideas, sort of the idea that you're both agreeing to protect one's sovereignty, those are a lot harder to break. And as a result, those alliances sort of become like a chain link. And when you try to break them, it's a much more violent reaction. Another part of the answer is paranoia, because often these alliances weren't announced to the entire world. So, for example, when France and Great Britain will sign alliances, they don't announce to everybody the details of that alliance. So if I'm sitting over here and I'm Germany, I don't know exactly what the French and the British are planning. Are they planning on secretly attacking me, and that's why they had this big meeting that lasted months and months? Well, I need to make sure that I have even more allies, so I'm going to start looking for other outside allies. Maybe the Ottoman Turks over here, the Italians over here, or maybe the Japanese on the East Asian peninsulas will be able to help us distract the British and the French. And that's how the paranoia starts. And we're going to see it big time. Another really big issue, this is going to be the issue that actually brings Great Britain into World War I, is the issue of Belgian independence. The Belgians basically are a state that gets created out of the sort of loosely related to the French Revolution. But what happens is in the early 1800s, Great Britain makes a guarantee on their independence because Belgium, excuse me, is this little state in red right here. And as you can see, they're kind of sandwiched in between the two, what are going to become superpowers of Germany and France. So the real worry was that, well, what if Germany or France wants to incorporate Belgium into its country? Well, Great Britain saw that Belgium was a valuable economic trading partner and basically said, look, we're going to make sure you remain independent, and if anybody messes with you, they mess with the might of the British Empire. Now, excuse me, that might seem relatively unimportant, but it's going to be really important because that actually is going to be the territory that Germany first invades during World War I, and we're going to see that a little later. But I really want to emphasize this last point as well, is this idea is that the alliance system was hoped to make sure that no war was ever going to happen ever again. And on the face of it, this actually makes sense, right? I mean, if you've got all of these superpowers and they're aligned with each other, well, you're not going to attack one of them because you're going to set off this gigantic domino effect that's going to embroil the entire world in a war. But what happens is not quite that simple because the politics and the national identities don't work like they used to anymore. And a large part of that is nationalism, which we talked about, and a lot of that is the patriotic feeling. And we're going to see that big time. So one country that deserves some very special attention is Germany. And Germany in the 1860s and the 1870s is going to create what's called the German Empire. Now, compared to some other empires that we've talked about in this class, you can see the extent of the borders right here, it doesn't seem that impressive, right? Because, I mean, it's actually smaller than well, it doesn't encompass most of what's modern day Germany. It's not, gigantic like the Mongol Empire. It's not super impressive like the British colonial empire. But it's really important because of how they conquer the territory and what they do with it. Because Germany, if you remember way back to when we talked about the 7 Years' War, one of the things, and see, this is how it's all connected. When we talk about the 7 Years' War, one of the things that Great Britain does to win the 7 Years' War is they hire a Prussian general. Now, notice how I said Prussian, not Russian, Prussian with a P. Prussians are people who lived around here. They hired a Prussian general by the name of Frederick the Great in order to fight France and France's allies in Europe. And the reason they did this is to prevent the French from just simply crossing over the channel and attacking the British in Europe while they were fighting over in America or they were fighting over in India. So what happens is after Frederick the Great wins these battles against France, he sort of starts to pull territory away from France. He starts to take some of the territory that the French and the French allies used to control, and this is going to lay the seeds for German nationalism. And the idea is that when later German thinkers are going to come onto the scene, they're going to say, look, our society, our country, from time immemorial has founded itself on ideas of warfare and conquest. And that's going to be a very dangerous idea because when we talked about nationalism, we often think about nationalism in, you imagine the American flag and bald eagles and all that kind of stuff. Well, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the Germans were using nationalism as a way to justify conquest. And so what happens is the Germans sort of situated right here, they unite a bunch of states under a guy named Otto von Bismarck. But what happens is after they unite the states, they say, well, this area right here that was then part of the Austrian Empire, well, that should be the sovereign territory of Germans. Germans have lived here for time immemorial, and in fact, there's more Germans living here than there are Austrians, so therefore it should be part of our empire. Well, obviously the Austrians don't like this very much, and they end up fighting, or the people over here might fight with them, or people up closer to Russia might fight with them. And so that's exactly how this process worked, is Germany starts to incorporate these people because of this idea of national unification, this idea that Germany needs to reunify its homeland. And that's an important word, homeland, the idea of a German homeland. And depending on who you ask, this either is or is definitely not German homeland. The important part's not whether or not it really is German homeland. It's the fact that they use it as a justification for conquering much of this territory. Well, what do they do with that territory when they get it? Well, the Germans are unique in European history because what they do is they take industrial revolution ideas and they run with it big time. They do not just half-ass industrialism. And remember, we talked about industrialism. We talked about how it starts in Great Britain, and that's true. But see, Great Britain is also interested in what's going on in its colonies. It's interested in overseas trade. Germany's not really interested in much of that. Germany's mostly interested in land-based economy. And one of the things that I say here, it becomes an economic, military, and industrial powerhouse. Their industrial output by the turn of the 1900s, so basically the amount of stuff that comes out of their factories, was more than the combined output of all of Russia, all of France, and all of Great Britain combined. And the reason that they were able to do this is because they had this unified national idea. And so this idea was that you have this strong dictator on top, and he's the guy who's supposed to basically unify everybody behind a common goal. And that common goal was getting ahead and having better industrial production, better economic production, and better military production, all of these things. So what happens because of this? Well, one of the things that happens, and this happens actually still today, and if you don't believe me, you can look at declassified documents from the Vietnam War era or the Soviet Union era. Countries, even in times of peace, excuse me one second, even in times of peace, countries will explicitly make contingency plans for what to do in the event of a major war. America does this today. The Soviet Union did this in the 1960s and 70s. It's not unusual. Oftentimes they're not put into action. And one of those plans that the Germans develop is called the Schlieffen Plan. And this is what you're looking at right here is the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan basically is this. Germany recognizes when they're conquering these small little territories over here, that's not a big problem because they have an incredible amount of industrial capacity. Well, what happens if France gets really upset about what Germany's doing? What happens if the Russians get really upset about what the Germans are doing? Remember, the Americans, or excuse me, the British and French and Russians are all allied at this point. And so one of the things that Germans were really, really worried about was, well, if France attacks us and Russia attacks us, we have to fight in a two-front war. We have to fight on both sides of our country, and that would be impossible for us to do. So what we're going to do in the event of a war between these two, this was a contingency plan, right? What we're going to do in the event that something bad like this happens, we're going to attack France and try to get them immediately out of the war. We're trying to get them out as quickly as possible so that we can focus all of our attention on Russia. Well, if you look at this map in the bottom right, you can see here that what France has done is France has fortified the border. So Germany is over here and France is over here. They've fortified the border very heavily between France and Germany. And the idea was that if the Germans attack, well, we have this fortification all set up. But the thing was they didn't extend it to the coast because Belgium is right here. Well, they don't need to worry about Belgium invading, so they didn't bother setting this up with intensive fortifications. The Germans know this, and they say instead of trying to assault this and taking forever, what we need to do is we need to rush into France and then sweep from the side through Belgium and through Holland and Luxembourg and basically rip and just take Paris off immediately, and then we'll be done with France in 2 months, and then we can focus on the Russians. That's what the Schlieffen Plan says. Basically, take France out of the war by going through Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland. Well, this is actually going to be exactly what they do in World War I, and we're going to see how it works in a little bit. But one of the things that happens is German expansion terrifies other